The morning of August 8th, 1936. Berlin. An 18-year-old kid from Brooklyn named Marty Glickman has trained his entire life for this moment. In a few hours, he'll run in front of 100,000 people. In a stadium built to showcase Adolf Hitler's vision of Aryan supremacy. He never got the chance. The official explanation was that Germany was hiding secret sprinters. The real reason would haunt American sports for 60 years. This is the story of the gold medal that was stolen. Not by the Nazis, by Americans. Martin Irving Glickman was born August 14, 1917, in the East Bronx, the son of Romanian Jewish immigrants who had fled the pogroms of Iași just 5 years earlier. His father Harry carried his own athletic wound. He'd won a 100-meter dash back in Romania, but school officials gave the prize to the mayor's son. A Jew couldn't be seen winning. The family settled in the Flatbush neighborhood of Brooklyn, a melting pot of Jewish, Italian, and Irish families packed into tenement buildings and brownstones. The streets were alive with the sounds of pushcart vendors, the smell of fresh bread from corner bakeries, and the crack of stickball bats echoing off brick walls. Young Marty was small for his age, but fast, impossibly fast. In the streets of Brooklyn, they called him the fastest kid on the block. He ran everywhere, racing the elevated trains, sprinting past horse-drawn milk carts, leaving bigger kids in his dust. His father recognized something special. Harry would take young Marty to the beach at Coney Island, timing his sprints in the sand with a pocket watch. The dream was audacious for an immigrant family, an Olympic gold medal, something no one could take away. The Depression had hit Brooklyn hard. Families scraped by on whatever work they could find. Harry Glickman sold cotton goods door to door, schlepping heavy sample cases through neighborhoods where people had little money to spend. But he never stopped believing in his son's gift. Every spare dollar went toward athletic equipment, track shoes, entry fees for meets. The Glickmans understood something about America. Talent could open doors that money and connections kept closed. If Marty was fast enough, if he was undeniable, maybe the world would have to accept him. Maybe being Jewish wouldn't matter if he crossed the finish line first. At James Madison High School in Brooklyn, Glickman became a legend. He won the city championship, the state championship, and the national sprint championship. The newspapers dubbed him the Flatbush Flash. He was the fastest high school athlete in America. College recruiters came calling, but this was 1930s America, and talent wasn't enough. The Ivy League schools that should have recruited him, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, had quotas, unwritten limits on how many Jews they'd accept. Some simply didn't want Jews at all. Glickman enrolled at Syracuse University only because 5 Jewish alumni pooled their money to pay his tuition. They told him, "We want to get a Jewish athlete into Syracuse to make it easier for the ones who come after." It was a burden and an honor. Marty carried the weight of every Jewish kid who'd been told he wasn't good enough, wasn't the right kind, didn't belong. He didn't disappoint. By his freshman year, he'd set 4 American records in the 400-meter dash. He was fast, driven, and at 18 years old, selected for the 1936 United States Olympic team. At Syracuse, Glickman wasn't just a track star. He played football too, starting as a halfback for the varsity team. He was an All-American in both sports, a rare double threat who could sprint past defenders on the football field and then change into track spikes to set records. His coaches marveled at his versatility, his work ethic, his sheer physical intelligence. But it was track where his heart truly lived. The 100 meters, the 200, the relay, the pure, unmediated test of speed. No teammates to blame, No referees to second guess. Just you and the clock and the finish line. When the Olympic trials came in 1936, Marty Glickman was ready. On the voyage to Germany aboard the SS Manhattan, Glickman met the other Jewish sprinter on the team, 21-year-old Sam Stoller from the University of Michigan. Sam was quieter than Marty, more reserved, but equally talented. They were the only two. Out of over 300 American athletes, swimmers and boxers and runners and rowers, exactly 2 were Jewish. The selection process had been rigorous, fair by the standards of the day, but someone had been counting. Someone always was. During the 9-day crossing, Glickman and Stoller practiced their baton exchanges on the ship's deck, dreaming of gold. Neither of them knew that fact, that they were Jewish, would matter more than their speed. To understand what happened to Marty Glickman, you first have to understand what Berlin 1936 really was. Adolf Hitler had initially dismissed the Olympics as, his words, a conspiracy of Freemasons and Jews. But propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels convinced him of something crucial. These games could showcase the master race to the world. They could prove Nazi ideology on the world stage. Germany spent 20 million Reichsmarks, $8 million in 1936 money, building a 325-acre sports complex. The centerpiece was the Olympic Stadium, 100,000 seats of limestone and steel, designed by architect Werner March to dwarf anything the ancient Greeks had built. The Nazis invented spectacle as propaganda. They created the Olympic torch relay, a runner carrying flame from ancient Olympia in Greece through 7 countries to Berlin. It was pure theater, designed to connect Hitler's Germany to the glory of classical civilization. They staged the first televised Olympics in history. 25 television viewing rooms across Berlin broadcast the games to over 150,000 viewers. Filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl deployed 33 camera operators and months of editing to create Olympia, a documentary that would define how the world remembered these games. The opening ceremony on August 1, 1936, was unlike anything the world had seen. 100,000 spectators packed the Olympic Stadium. The Hindenburg airship floated overhead, trailing the Olympic flag. Hitler entered to thunderous applause, taking his seat in the private box that overlooked the stadium. 20,000 carrier pigeons were released into the sky. The Olympic hymn, composed by Richard Strauss, filled the air. It was theater on a scale that Hollywood couldn't match. And it was all designed to make one point. Nazi Germany was a modern, civilized nation that the world should embrace, not fear. The athletes marching in were props in a propaganda film they didn't know they were making. And then they hid the truth. On Hitler's personal orders, Jews not welcome signs disappeared from shop windows across Germany. The viciously anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer vanished from newsstands. Brown-shirt thugs were ordered to stop beating Jews in public, at least until the foreign visitors went home. German Jews themselves, as one recalled, were waiting with bated breath for what happens when the games were over. They knew this was a pause, not a change. Most foreign visitors were fooled completely. The New York Times reported that the games had put Germany back in the fold of nations. American tourists returned home praising German efficiency, German hospitality, German order. But some saw through it. William Shirer, the CBS correspondent who would later write The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, was not deceived. He wrote in his diary, "The Nazis have succeeded with their propaganda. They have put up a very good front for foreign visitors, especially the businessmen. It may not last, but it has worked." Behind the facade, the persecution continued. Jewish athletes were systematically excluded. Gretel Bergmann, Germany's best female high jumper, had tied the national record on June 30th, a mark that would have won Olympic gold. 2 weeks before the opening ceremony, she received a letter, removed for underperformance. Her record was erased from the official books. She was replaced by an athlete later revealed to be male. A bizarre humiliation designed to keep a Jewish woman off the victory podium. For the American Jewish athletes, Berlin was a strange and unsettling experience. The anti-Semitism wasn't visible on the streets, scrubbed clean for the games, but they could feel it in the air. German officials were polite, correct, efficient, but there was something behind their smiles that made the Jewish athletes uneasy. Sam Stoller later recalled sensing hostility, a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. Marty Glickman remembered seeing Germans point at him and whisper. Were they admiring his athleticism or something else? The Jewish athletes trained, ate, and slept in the same Olympic village as everyone else. But they knew they were different. They knew that in this country, people like them were being stripped of their rights, their businesses, their dignity. They were guests in a house that wanted them gone. Captain Wolfgang Fürstner was the head of the Olympic Village, responsible for housing and feeding thousands of athletes from around the world. He did his job brilliantly. The athletes praised the facilities, the food, the organization. But someone discovered that Fürstner had Jewish ancestry. He was quietly removed from his position before the closing ceremony, replaced by a racially pure German. 2 days after the games ended, Wolfgang Fürstner shot himself. This was the true face of Hitler's Olympics. Jewish athletes erased, hidden, eliminated, careers destroyed, lives ended. But surely that couldn't happen to the American team. Could it? The most important figure in this story isn't German. He's American. Avery Brundage was a self-made Chicago construction millionaire, a former 1912 Olympian who'd competed in the pentathlon and decathlon, and in 1936, the president of the American Olympic Committee. He was the man who decided whether America would go to Berlin at all. He was also, by any reasonable assessment of the historical record, a virulent anti-Semite. Brundage came from modest origins. He'd worked his way through the University of Illinois, built a construction empire through ruthless ambition, and never forgot a slight. He believed deeply in the Olympic ideal, or at least his version of it. Amateur athletics free from politics, from commerce, from what he called outside influences. A powerful movement had formed to boycott the Nazi Olympics. Judge Jeremiah Mahoney, the president of the Amateur Athletic Union, and an Irish Catholic with no personal stake in Jewish persecution, led the charge. He warned that participation would mean giving American moral and financial support to the Nazi regime. Catholic organizations joined the boycott movement. The American Federation of Labor passed a resolution against participation. Prominent newspapers editorialized against sending American athletes to Berlin. The pressure was real. Brundage fought the boycott with everything he had. The boycott debate tore the American athletic community apart. On one side were those who believed sport transcended politics, that the Olympics was sacred ground where nations came together in peaceful competition. On the other were those who saw participation as legitimizing a regime that had already begun to persecute its own citizens. The arguments grew bitter. Friendships ended. Organizations split. Catholic war veterans organized against participation. Jewish groups pleaded for a boycott. But the Amateur Athletic Union, the governing body of American track and field, remained divided. And at the center of the debate stood Avery Brundage, pushing relentlessly for participation. In September 1934, Brundage made a fact-finding trip to Germany. It was brief, just 6 days, and tightly controlled by Nazi handlers. He wasn't permitted to meet with Jewish sports leaders alone. Every conversation was translated by Nazi officials who could shade meanings however they wished. Brundage returned, declaring that German Jews were being treated fairly, that the stories of persecution were exaggerated, that the games should proceed. Congressman Emanuel Seller of Brooklyn, himself Jewish, charged that Brundage had prejudged the situation before he sailed. Brundage dismissed his critics as, his exact words, a Jewish communist conspiracy. What Brundage said and wrote tells its own story. When informed that Jews couldn't join German sports clubs, he reportedly replied, "In my club in Chicago, Jews are not permitted either." The Chicago Athletic Association, where Brundage was a member, did indeed exclude Jews, just as it excluded blacks and Catholics. In private correspondence, Brundage complained to British Olympic officials, "My own view is that we are pandering too much to the Jews." He saw the boycott movement not as a moral stance against fascism, but as a Jewish plot to undermine sport. Documents from his papers show a pattern of anti-Semitic remarks, stretching across decades. What Brundage failed to mention was his business interests in Germany. His construction company had contracts with German firms. He saw the Nazi regime as a bulwark against communism, a force for order in a chaotic world. In letters to friends, he expressed admiration for what Hitler had accomplished, rebuilding Germany from the ashes of defeat, restoring national pride, putting people back to work. That this reconstruction was built on the backs of persecuted minorities, that it was preparing for a war that would consume the world, seemed not to trouble him. For Brundage, the Olympics were above such concerns, or perhaps more accurately, the Olympics were a useful tool for advancing his own vision of the world. Just 2 months after the Olympics, Avery Brundage addressed the pro-Nazi German-American Bund at Madison Square Garden. The Bund was an organization of American Nazi sympathizers, complete with swastika banners and Hitler salutes. Brundage praised Germany to the crowd. 5 years ago, they were discouraged and demoralized. Today they are united, 60 million people believing in themselves and in their country. He described the Berlin Games as the greatest Olympic Games in history. The FBI would investigate Brundage in 1942 for pro-Nazi sympathies, though no charges were ever filed. On December 8, 1935, the Amateur Athletic Union voted on whether to participate in the Berlin Olympics. The debate was fierce. Mahoney argued passionately against participation, citing documented evidence of Jewish persecution. Brundage countered that politics should never interfere with sport. The final count, 58.25 to 55.75. America would go to Hitler's games by a margin of 2.5 votes. Had 3 delegates voted differently, the United States might have stayed home, and the Berlin Olympics might have collapsed without American participation. Instead, Avery Brundage would travel to Berlin to make sure nothing embarrassed his Nazi hosts. The vote was held by secret ballot. Delegates from athletic clubs across America cast their votes, weighing patriotism against principle, tradition against conscience. When the final count was announced, the room fell silent. 58-25 to 55-75. The margin was so close that a single club changing its vote could have reversed the outcome. Mahoney, who had fought so hard against participation, looked devastated. Brundage, triumphant, immediately began planning the logistics of sending American athletes to Berlin. The die was cast. America would compete in Hitler's Olympics, and Avery Brundage would make sure the games went smoothly, no matter who had to be sacrificed. August 8, 1936, the day before the 400-meter relay heats. the American track team had already dominated the individual sprints. Jesse Owens had won the 100 meters, the 200 meters, and the long jump, 3 gold medals that infuriated Hitler and electrified the world. Ralph Metcalfe had taken silver in the 100 meters. The relay was supposed to be a victory lap, a chance for other sprinters to earn their gold. The previous afternoon, head coach Lawson Robertson had told reporters that Jesse Owens has had enough glory and collected enough gold medals to last him a while. He announced the relay team: Glickman, Stoller, Wyckoff, and either Draper or Metcalfe. The next morning at 9 a.m., all 7 sprinters were summoned to a meeting at the athletes' quarters in the Olympic Village. Present in the room, head coach Lawson Robertson, who had led American track teams since 1912. Assistant coach Dean Cromwell, the legendary USC track coach, known as the Maker of Champions, who had coached more Olympians than any other American. And the athletes: Jesse Owens, Ralph Metcalfe, Marty Glickman, Sam Stoller, Foy Draper, Frank Wyckoff, and one alternate. The meeting room was small, cramped. The sprinters crowded together, expecting routine instructions about race strategy and baton exchanges. What happened next, Marty Glickman would recount the same way for 60 years, never varying in detail, never softening in anger. Robertson announced that he had heard very strong rumors that the Germans were saving their best sprinters, hiding them, to upset the Americans in the relay. Consequently, Sam Stoller and Marty Glickman were to be replaced by Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalfe. There was a moment of stunned silence. Glickman recalled, "We were shocked. Sam was completely stunned. He didn't say a word. The replacement made no athletic sense. Glickman and Stoller had been practicing baton exchanges for 2 weeks. Owens and Metcalfe had not practiced relay handoffs at all. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. In that brief time, the dreams of 2 young men were destroyed. Neither Glickman nor Stoller had been given any warning. Neither had any opportunity to appeal. The decision was presented as final, absolute, not subject to discussion. Looking back decades later, Glickman would marvel at the cruelty of it. They could have told us the day before. They could have let us prepare. Instead, they summoned us to a meeting and announced that our Olympic careers were over. Just like that. 2 weeks of training, a lifetime of preparation, wiped away in a moment. But 18-year-old Marty wasn't silent. "Coach," he said, "you can't hide world-class sprinters." It was an obvious point, one any serious track observer would understand. Elite sprinters have to compete regularly to maintain their explosive edge. You can't just pull them out of a hat at the last minute and expect them to run world-class times. The German sprinters were known quantities. Erich Borschmeier, their best, had finished 5th in the 100 meters, nearly a full second behind Owens. There was no hidden threat. The excuse was absurd on its face, and everyone in that room knew it. Then Glickman said what everyone was thinking. "Coach, you know that Sam and I are the only 2 Jews on the track team. If we don't run, there's bound to be a lot of criticism back home." He had named the unnameable. In that small room, with Nazi flags flying outside, with Hitler watching from his private box, an 18-year-old Jewish kid from Brooklyn had accused his coaches of anti-Semitism. The silence was heavy. Dean Cromwell's response was 4 words that Glickman would remember for the rest of his life. "We'll take our chances." What happened next should have changed everything. Jesse Owens, who had already won 3 gold medals in the 100 meters, 200 meters, and long jump, stood up and spoke. Owens was the most famous athlete in the world at that moment. He had single-handedly demolished Nazi theories of Aryan supremacy. His voice carried weight that few others could match. "Coach," Owens said, I've won my 3 gold medals. I'm tired. I've had it. Let Marty and Sam run. They deserve it." Dean Cromwell pointed his finger at Jesse Owens and said, "You'll do as you're told." The other sprinters were stunned too. Frank Wyckoff, a veteran of 2 previous Olympics, had assumed Glickman and Stoller would run. Foy Draper, a USC athlete coached by Cromwell, said nothing, but his face showed confusion. Only Jesse Owens had the courage to speak up, and he had been silenced. The meeting ended with the sprinters filing out in shock. Glickman and Stoller walked together, not speaking. What was there to say? Everything they had worked for, every sacrifice their families had made, every dream they had nurtured since childhood, had been taken from them by men who never explained why. Not really, not honestly. In that moment, the hierarchy was clear. Owens had defied Hitler, but he could not defy Dean Cromwell. Glickman later reflected, "In those days, black athletes did as they were told, and Jesse was quiet after that." It was 1936. Jesse Owens had no power beyond his legs. He had challenged the decision and been slapped down. There was nothing more he could do. Owens himself later expressed regret for not fighting harder, for accepting the extra gold medal that rightfully belonged to Glickman or Stoller. But in that room, in that moment, even Jesse Owens was powerless against the men who controlled American athletics. Sam Stoller's 21st birthday fell on that devastating day, August 8, 1936. He should have been celebrating, anticipating the race of his life. Instead, he sat in shock, barely able to speak. In his diary, he wrote that it was the most humiliating episode of his life. Glickman remarked bitterly to the press, "A fine present for Sam, wasn't it?" The 2 Jewish athletes left the meeting knowing they would never run in the Olympic Games. Sam Stoller would never compete internationally again. He would carry the wound for the rest of his life, dying in 1985 without ever receiving acknowledgment or apology. Marty Glickman would carry it too, but he would also find a way to fight back. In the hours after the meeting, Glickman tried to understand what had happened. He replayed the conversation in his mind, searching for some explanation that made sense. Had he done something wrong? Had his performance been lacking? The answer was no. He had trained perfectly, run his best times, followed every instruction. The only thing he had done was be born Jewish. That was his crime, his disqualification, his unforgivable sin in the eyes of Avery, Brundage, and Dean Cromwell. He was 18 years old, and he had just learned a lesson about America that he would carry for the rest of his life. Sometimes, no matter how hard you work, no matter how good you are, they will find a reason to keep you out. The relay finals took place the next day, August 9th, 1936. If the coaches were right, if Germany really had been hiding world-class sprinters, this would be a close race. The American team lined up. Jesse Owens running first leg, Ralph Metcalfe second, Foy Draper third, Frank Wyckoff anchoring. None of them had practiced together. The baton exchanges would be improvised, relying on pure athletic instinct rather than the precise choreography that relay teams normally develop over weeks of training. In the stands, Marty Glickman watched. So did Sam Stoller. So did 100,000 spectators, including Adolf Hitler in his private box. The starter's gun fired. Jesse Owens exploded from the blocks with the same devastating speed that had won him 3 gold medals. He handed off to Metcalfe, who powered through the curve. Draper maintained the lead. Wyckoff took the baton for the anchor leg. The time, 39.8 seconds, a world record that would stand for 20 years. The winning margin, 15 yards, 15 yards. In sprinting, that's an eternity. It's not a race, it's a demolition. Germany finished 4th,
later moved to third after the Netherlands was disqualified for a dropped baton. They were 1.4 seconds behind. The hidden German superstars never materialized. Because they never existed, the relay was supposed to be America's showcase event. The 4 fastest men in the world running together, passing the baton in perfect synchronization. The coaches had weeks to assemble the optimal team, to practice the handoffs until they were seamless. Instead, they threw together a makeshift squad at the last minute, replacing their trained relay runners with athletes who had never practiced together. It was either supreme confidence or complete indifference to competitive excellence. America would win anyway, the coaches seemed to believe. It didn't matter who ran. They were right about the winning. They were wrong about everything else. The official explanation was demolished by the race itself. America won by such an absurd margin that the excuse of secret German sprinters became a joke. Frank Wyckoff, who ran the anchor leg, later told documentary filmmaker Bud Greenspan, "We hadn't worked with Jesse or Ralph at all. I think that if Glickman and Stoller had run, we would have had just as fast a time, if not faster." Lou Zamperini, the famous Olympian later celebrated in the book and film Unbroken, quipped, "With Glickman in there, they wouldn't have won by 15 yards, maybe 14. The joke was bitter. Everyone knew the truth. The best runners had not run. Marty Glickman watched from the stands. Years later, he described the moment with a pain that time had not diminished. "Watching the final, I see Metcalf passing runners down the backstretch, and I thought, that should be me out there. That should be me. That's me out there." The gold medal that Jesse Owens wore around his neck, his 4th of the games, was the medal that should have belonged to Marty Glickman or Sam Stoller. Owens knew it. He never displayed that particular medal. He kept it hidden away, as if ashamed of how he'd come to possess it. If you're finding this documentary informative, please subscribe and click the notification bell to stay updated on future historical content. The Italian team finished second, a full second behind. The Netherlands finished third before being disqualified. Germany, with their supposedly hidden world-class sprinters, finished 4th with a time of 41.2 seconds. The margin wasn't competitive, it was embarrassing. Whatever threat Germany posed existed only in the imagination of coaches looking for an excuse. The American B team, the replacement squad, the athletes who hadn't practiced together, still crushed the field. Imagine what the real team could have done. Imagine Glickman bursting from the blocks on the first leg, Stoller maintaining the lead, the baton passing smoothly to Draper and Wyckoff. The world record might have been even faster, but we'll never know. Glickman made himself a vow in those stands. Come 1940, he would win it all. The 100, the 200, the relay. He would be 22 years old, the perfect age for a sprinter. He had 4 years to prepare, 4 years to become even faster, 4 years to earn the gold medal that had been stolen from him. But 1940 never came. The Tokyo Olympics were cancelled. There was a war on, and 1944 never came either. The London Olympics were cancelled too. By the time the Games resumed in 1948, Glickman was 30 years old, past his prime as a sprinter. Marty Glickman would never run in an Olympic Games. That 18-year-old kid from Brooklyn, the fastest in America, never got his chance. The medal ceremony was a spectacle of Nazi propaganda. The American flag rose to the top of the pole as the Star-Spangled Banner played. Jesse Owens, Ralph Metcalf, Foy Draper, and Frank Wyckoff stood on the podium, gold medals around their necks. Somewhere in the stands, Marty Glickman watched. He should have been up there. He had earned the right to be up there. Instead, he was a spectator at his own triumph, watching other men receive the medal that should have been his. The crowd cheered. The cameras clicked. and history recorded a relay team that was never supposed to run together, while the rightful runners were erased from the story.
So what really happened in that meeting? For decades, Glickman used only the vague word politics. He didn't tell his own children the full story until his daughter saw a documentary about Jesse Owens in junior high school. "Why did you never tell us?" she asked. "It's not a nice story," he replied. But the evidence, examined carefully, points to a conclusion that the American Olympic establishment would spend 60 years trying to avoid. The removal of Glickman and Stoller was not about athletics. It was not about hidden German sprinters. It was about keeping Jewish athletes off Hitler's victory podium. Consider the facts. Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller were the only two Jewish athletes on the U.S. track team. They were the only two members of the entire U.S. Olympic delegation, over 300 athletes, who traveled to Berlin and never competed. Not injured, not ill, simply removed at the last minute by coaches who claimed absurdly that the Germans had secret sprinters. They remain to this day the only fit American track athletes in Olympic history to be denied the opportunity to run. Every other healthy American athlete at those games competed. Only the two Jewish sprinters did not. Both men who made the decision had documented histories of prejudice. Dean Cromwell, the assistant coach who told Jesse Owens, "You'll do as you're told," was not subtle about his views. In his 1941 book, Championship Technique in Track and Field, he wrote, "The Negro athlete excels because he is closer to the primitive than the white man." It was not so long ago that his ability to sprint and jump was a life and death matter to him in the jungle. This was not an obscure private comment. This was published in a book meant to train coaches, 5 years after he'd silenced Jesse Owens in Berlin. Cromwell's racial views were part of the public record. The pattern of exclusion extended beyond Glickman and Stoller. In the 1936 boxing competition, American boxers faced German opponents in several weight classes. The referees, all German, made decisions that favored the home country in close fights. American coaches protested. Nothing changed. The message was clear. These were Hitler's games, run by Hitler's officials, designed to produce Hitler's desired outcomes. The American coaches saw this happening. They knew the fix was in. And yet, when it came to the relay, they chose to accommodate rather than resist. They removed their Jewish athletes rather than risk Hitler's displeasure. 2 months after the Olympics, Cromwell addressed 3,000 followers of the German-American Alliance. His message: if you read any of the reports of the unpleasantness in Germany or of the reception of the American Olympic team, don't believe them. He was telling pro-Nazi Americans to ignore reports of persecution. Both Brundage and Cromwell were founding members of the America First Committee, the isolationist movement that opposed American involvement in World War II. The committee's most prominent spokesman was Charles Lindbergh, who would deliver notorious anti-Semitic speeches, blaming Jews for pushing America toward war with Germany. The teammates who replaced Glickman and Stoller knew exactly what had happened. Ralph Metcalfe, who would later become a U.S. congressman representing Chicago, stated clearly, "I thought at the time it was terrible. It was unjust to leave 2 athletes off the team just because they were Jewish." Frank Wyckoff, who remained on the team and won gold, admitted, "Down in my heart, I think it was done the way it was because of the Jewish thing." These were not outside observers speculating. These were the men in the room, the men who benefited from the decision, and even they knew it was wrong. The US Hockey kept no official records of the meeting where the decision was made. No minutes survive. No memo explains the reasoning. The only accounts we have come from the athletes themselves, particularly Marty Glickman, who told the story consistently for 60 years. Some historians have suggested alternative explanations.
Perhaps the coaches genuinely believed in the German threat. Perhaps they wanted to add to Jesse Owens's medal count. Perhaps they thought Owens and Metcalf were simply faster. But none of these explanations account for the timing, the secrecy, or the fact that only the two Jewish athletes were removed. Occam's razor suggests the simplest explanation. It was anti-Semitism, plain and simple. Glickman himself came to believe that propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had told Brundage that Hitler would be very displeased if Jews were to race in his Olympic Games. He acknowledged he couldn't produce documentary proof. No smoking gun has ever surfaced in Brundage's papers. Perhaps Brundage destroyed the evidence. Perhaps the conversation was never documented. Perhaps it was simply understood, without needing to be spoken, that Brundage would do what was necessary to avoid embarrassing his Nazi hosts. Historian David Clay Large, who wrote the definitive book on the Nazi Olympics, examined all the available evidence. His conclusion: while the removal of Glickman and Stoller never bothered Brundage, it haunted the American Olympic establishment for decades after. The establishment knew. They always knew. They simply refused to acknowledge it. Brundage went on to serve as president of the International Olympic Committee from 1952 to 1972. He never apologized. He never expressed regret. He died in 1975, still insisting the decision had been purely athletic. The lie outlived the liars, but not forever. The question of why Brundage acted as he did has haunted historians for decades. Was he following orders from Nazi officials? Was he anticipating their wishes without being asked? Was he simply expressing his own prejudices, using the cover of athletic concerns to exclude athletes he personally disdained? The truth may be some combination of all three. What we know for certain is that Avery Brundage spent the rest of his life denying any wrongdoing, defending the decision, and attacking anyone who suggested anti-Semitism was involved. The lady doth protest too much, as Shakespeare wrote. Brundage's vehement denials only strengthened the case against him. Marty Glickman never got his Olympic gold, but he found another way to make his mark. After briefly playing professional football as a halfback for the Jersey City Giants, where he was the leading ground gainer in 1939, Glickman transformed himself into something America had never quite seen before, a pioneer of sports broadcasting. He trained his voice obsessively, reciting poetry by Poe and Chaucer, and the 4 questions from the Passover Seder that he chanted as a child. He practiced articulation exercises until his diction was flawless, his pacing instinctive. In 1943, he called what may have been the first radio broadcast of a basketball game. The sport was barely known outside of gymnasiums. Glickman helped make it a spectacle. In 1946, he became the first voice of the New York Knicks, describing a sport most Americans had never seen to listeners who had to imagine every play. In 1954, he became the NBA's first television announcer, translating basketball for the new medium. He understood that sports broadcasting wasn't about describing what happened. It was about making listeners feel like they were there. Broadcasting wasn't an obvious career path for a Jewish athlete in the 1940s. The airwaves were dominated by voices that sounded a certain way, looked a certain way, came from certain backgrounds. Glickman faced the same quotas and prejudices that had limited his athletic opportunities. Radio stations weren't eager to hire Jewish announcers. Sponsors worried about alienating audiences. But Glickman had something that transcended prejudice. He was simply better than everyone else. His descriptions were clearer, his timing more precise, his enthusiasm more infectious. Eventually, even the skeptics had to admit that the kid from Brooklyn belonged behind the microphone. He broadcast for the Knicks for 21 years, the Giants for 23, the Jets for 11. He invented the vocabulary we still use for basketball. The key, the lane, the top of the circle. Good, like a count of 3. And one word that became his signature, delivered with perfect timing. At the moment a shot swished through the net. Swish. Jack Kerouac wrote in On the Road. Have you dug that mad Marty Glickman? Absolutely the greatest announcer I ever heard. The beat poet understood what Glickman was doing, creating rhythm, creating poetry from the chaos of sport. Glickman mentored a generation of broadcasters who would become legends themselves. Marv Albert, Bob Costas, Dick Enberg. He taught them to see the game, to anticipate the play, to find the perfect word at the perfect moment. Bob Costas called him to basketball what Red Barber was to baseball. The kid who'd been denied his moment on the track found his voice in the broadcast booth. He couldn't run the race, so he learned to tell the story. The irony wasn't lost on Glickman. He had been silenced in Berlin, denied the chance to prove himself on the track, but in the broadcast booth he found a voice that reached millions. Every game he called, every race he described, was a kind of revenge. They tried to erase him, and instead he became one of the most famous voices in American sports. The sprinter who never ran in the Olympics became the announcer who defined how Americans experience basketball, football, and track. They stole his race. He built a career that lasted half a century. For 40 years, Glickman kept his anger private. When asked about Berlin, he used only that careful word, politics. He didn't want to be defined by what had been done to him. He wanted to be known for what he had built. Starting in 1979, something changed. He began giving oral histories, speaking to Jewish organizations, ORT, B'nai B'rith, UJA, telling the full story, naming names. At the 1996 Holocaust Museum exhibit The Nazi Olympics, Marty Glickman publicly declared what he'd long believed. Avery Brundage was an American Nazi who wanted to spare Hitler the embarrassment of Jews on the victory podium. After 60 years, he was done being silent. In 1991, HBO produced a documentary about the 1936 Olympics called Olympiad. Martin Scorsese served as executive producer. The film told Glickman's story to a national audience, many of whom had never heard it before. For the first time, mainstream America learned about the 2 Jewish sprinters who were pulled from the relay. The documentary won an Emmy Award. More importantly, it forced the American Olympic establishment to confront a history they had long preferred to forget. Glickman, now in his 70s, finally felt that his story was being heard. The silencing that began in Berlin was finally, slowly, being undone.
Marty Glickman returned to the Olympic Stadium 3 times. Each visit revealed a wound that time could not heal. In 1985, he visited as part of a tribute to Jesse Owens, who had died in 1980. What happened surprised him more than anyone, his own account. As I walked into the stadium, I began to get so angry. I began to get so mad. It shocked the hell out of me that this thing of 49 years ago could still evoke this anger. The stadium looked almost exactly as it had in 1936. The limestone facades, the massive columns, Hitler's private box still there overlooking the track. Glickman continued, I was cussing. I was with colleagues, and I was cussing. I was really amazed at myself, not about the German Nazis. That was a given. But anger at Avery Brundage and Dean Cromwell for not allowing an 18-year-old kid to compete in the Olympic Games just because he was Jewish. 49 years, nearly half a century, and the rage was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. The anger that Glickman felt in 1985 surprised even him. He had thought he'd made peace with what happened. He had built a successful career, raised a family, earned respect in his profession. Why should a stadium, half a century later, reduce him to cursing in front of colleagues? But trauma doesn't work that way. The body keeps the score. Standing in the place where his dreams had been stolen, Glickman felt 18 again, felt the shock and betrayal as fresh as if it had happened that morning. Some wounds don't heal, they just wait. In August 1994, Giants owner Wellington Mara personally invited Glickman to accompany the team for a preseason game in Berlin. It was the first time he'd set foot on German soil since 1936, 58 years later. ESPN reporter Dave Klein was there. He described the scene. First, we went up flights of rickety old stairs to the private box where the impotent little madman had stood and turned his back on Owens. I must admit, being in the presence of evil incarnate was chilling. The box was small, cramped, just a viewing platform really, but it had been Hitler's throne. Then they walked the track, still there as it was in 1936. Marty walked it with a tear in his eye, silent and introspective. And then something happened. Suddenly, he turned. "Right here," he said in that distinctive voice. "Right here is where I would have made my move, where I would have cut to the front. Right here is where I would have put the field in my pocket." Klein watched in amazement. He had been walking with an old man's legs, but in his mind, he had been running that race, finally, somehow, fulfilling that missing piece of his life. When Glickman stood on the track in 1994 and pointed to the exact spot where he would have made his move, he was doing more than remembering. He was claiming something that had been denied him. For one moment in his mind, he ran the race he'd never been allowed to run. He saw himself bursting past the German sprinters, saw the tape breaking across his chest, saw the gold medal placed around his neck. It was imagination, fantasy, a dream that could never come true. But it was also defiance. They had taken the race from him, but they couldn't take the knowledge of what he could have done. That belonged to him forever. His daughter Nancy revealed what her father did on one of those returns to Berlin. He looked up at Hitler's box, empty now, silent, just stone and sky. And he yelled to Hitler's ghost, "I am still here, and you are not." Hitler was dead. Brundage was dead. Cromwell was dead. The Third Reich was rubble. But Marty Glickman was still standing, still speaking, still bearing witness. The boy they'd tried to erase had outlived them all, and he wanted them to know it. On March 29, 1998, 62 years after Berlin, USOC President William Heibel presented Marty Glickman with the first Douglas MacArthur Award. Sam Stoller, who had died in 1985 at age 69, received the honor posthumously. The plaque was presented in lieu of the gold medals they didn't win. Heibel's statement carried the weight of official acknowledgment. "I was a prosecutor. I'm used to looking at evidence. The evidence was there." The USOC expressed, "We regret this injustice." It wasn't an apology. Not quite. But it was something. The award ceremony was held in Colorado Springs at the United States Olympic Committee headquarters. Glickman, now 80 years old, walked slowly to the podium. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the plaque. In his acceptance speech, he spoke not of bitterness, but of vindication. For 62 years, he had been telling a story that many people didn't want to hear. Now, finally, the official guardians of American athletics were acknowledging that he had been telling the truth all along. The apology was inadequate. It came too late. Sam Stoller wasn't alive to receive it, but it was something. It was, at last, an admission that an injustice had been done. Marty Glickman died on January 3, 2001, at age 83. He was cremated with no funeral. His grandson Peter Alderman, 25 years old, was killed at the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, a tragedy his daughter Nancy believes her father was mercifully spared from witnessing. So why was Marty Glickman really pulled from the relay? The evidence points to American officials, Avery, Brundage, and Dean Cromwell, both documented anti-Semites with ties to pro-Nazi organizations, deciding that Jewish athletes should not stand on Hitler's victory podium. What can be proven is this. The official explanation was a lie. Only the 2 Jewish athletes were removed. Both decision-makers harbored anti-Jewish prejudice, and the American Olympic establishment eventually acknowledged the injustice 62 years too late. Marty Glickman never got his gold medal. But in bearing witness, in naming the perpetrators, in returning to Berlin to face down Hitler's ghost, he ensured the world would remember. The evil of 1936 didn't stay confined to Germany. It had collaborators who wore red, white, and blue,